Every American grows up hearing the same story. A small group of brave colonists stood up against a powerful empire. They fought for freedom, defeated the British, and gave birth to the United States of America. It's a story celebrated every 4th of July, repeated in classrooms, immortalized in Hollywood films, and remembered as one of the greatest victories in history. But what if that story is only half true? If the American Revolution wasn't simply a fight between liberty and tyranny, what if it was also a bitter civil war? Neighbors turned against neighbors, families were torn apart, and thousands of Americans remained loyal to the British Crown. And what if the road to independence didn't begin with the Boston Tea Party? Years earlier, on battlefields where Britain fought a completely different war, history is often written by the winners. Legends are remembered. The uncomfortable truths are often forgotten. Today, we're going beyond the myths, beyond the patriotic speeches, and beyond the version of history most people have been taught. This is the American independence story you were probably never told. In the middle of the 18th century, Britain had become the most powerful empire on Earth. Its navy ruled the oceans, its merchants controlled global trade, and its colonies stretched across continents. Among those colonies were 13 small settlements along the eastern coast of North America. Many people today, they seem like the birthplace of a future nation. But in the early 1700s, no one imagined they would one day become the United States. People living there still considered themselves British. They spoke English. They followed British laws. They proudly called the king their monarch. Life in the colonies was far from perfect, but compared to many parts of Europe, it offered opportunity, land, and economic growth. Farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and traders built thriving communities, while ships carried tobacco, timber, and other valuable goods across the Atlantic. For decades, the relationship between Britain and its American colonies remained surprisingly stable. But what changed? The answer wasn't found in Boston. It wasn't found in Philadelphia. It began thousands of miles away. In a brutal global conflict that would reshape the future of the British Empire forever. In 1754, Britain and France were already competing for power across North America. Both empires wanted control of the vast Ohio River Valley, a region rich in land, trade routes, and natural resources. What started as a struggle over territory soon exploded into one of the largest wars the 18th century had ever seen. Victory over France came at an enormous cost. By the end of the French and Indian War in 1763, Britain had emerged as the world's dominant empire. It had gained vast new territories across North America and removed its greatest rival from the continent. On paper, it looked like a historic triumph. Behind the celebrations was a harsh reality. War had nearly doubled Britain's national debt. Containing thousands of soldiers in North America, defending newly acquired territory, and protecting the colonies from future threats would require even more money. From London's perspective, the solution seemed obvious. The American colonies had benefited from Britain's victory. Surely, they should help pay for the cost of defending the empire. To British leaders, this wasn't oppression. It was responsibility. Across the Atlantic, many colonists saw things very differently. For generations, the colonies had enjoyed a remarkable degree of self-government. Local assemblies handled many internal affairs, and British interference had often been limited. Now that relationship was beginning to change. In 1764, Parliament introduced the Sugar Act, tightening customs enforcement and placing new duties on imported goods. A year later came something far more controversial, the Stamp Act. For the first time, nearly every printed document in the colonies, from newspapers and legal contracts to licenses and playing cards, required an official government stamp purchased from British authorities. The amount of money collected was relatively small. That wasn't the real issue. The real question was far more dangerous. Who had the right to tax the American colonies? Colonists had no elected representatives in the British Parliament. Yet Parliament insisted it had full authority to make laws for every part of the empire. Colonists disagreed. Their argument would soon be captured in a phrase that echoed across every colony: "No taxation without representation." Those 4 words became more than a political slogan. They became a movement. Merchants organized boycotts against British goods. Newspapers published fierce criticism of Parliament. Public meetings attracted growing crowds demanding colonial rights. Tensions continued to rise. Then, a secretive group began organizing resistance from the shadows. They called themselves the Sons of Liberty, made up of merchants, craftsmen, lawyers, and political activists. They believed Britain had crossed a dangerous line. They intimidated tax collectors, organized public protests, and encouraged ordinary colonists to resist British authority. Some viewed them as defenders of liberty. Others saw them as dangerous radicals willing to use violence for political goals. Either way, their influence spread rapidly. By 1766, widespread resistance forced Britain to repeal the Stamp Act. For many colonists, it felt like a victory. Parliament refused to surrender its authority. Instead, lawmakers passed the Declaratory Act, making one thing perfectly clear: Britain still claimed the absolute right to legislate for the colonies. In all cases whatsoever, conflict wasn't over. It had only been delayed. Over the next few years, new taxes, stricter enforcement, and growing mistrust pushed both sides even further apart. Neither London nor the colonies seemed willing to compromise. Each believed it was defending its constitutional rights. Each believed the other had become unreasonable. Then in March 1770, a confrontation in the streets of Boston changed everything. What began as a tense argument between civilians and British soldiers quickly spiraled out of control. Shots rang out. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead. The event would become known as the Boston Massacre. To Britain, it was a tragic incident caused by an angry mob. Patriot leaders, it became powerful propaganda. Engravings, speeches, and newspaper articles transformed the event into proof of British tyranny. Public anger exploded across the colonies. Trust between Britain and America was disappearing. And within just a few years, one act of protest would ignite a crisis that neither side could control. Boston Tea Party, the tension between Britain and the American colonies had reached a breaking point. After years of protests, new taxes, and growing mistrust, neither side was willing to back down. Every new law from Parliament was seen by many colonists as another attack on their rights. At the same time, British officials believed the colonies were becoming increasingly rebellious and difficult to govern. Then came the issue of tea. In 1773, the British government passed the Tea Act. Contrary to popular belief, it wasn't simply another tax increase. In fact, the act allowed the struggling British East India Company to sell tea directly to the American colonies at a lower price than before. From London's point of view, it was a practical solution. The government hoped to rescue one of Britain's most important companies while still collecting the existing tea tax. Many colonists saw something far more dangerous. If they accepted the cheaper tea, they believed they would also be accepting Parliament's right to tax them without their consent. For Patriot leaders, this wasn't about the price of tea. It was about principle. Throughout the colonies, resistance began to grow once again. Ships carrying East India Company tea arrived in several American ports. In many cities, angry crowds forced the ships to turn back without unloading their cargo. Boston was different. Massachusetts had become one of the strongest centers of colonial resistance, and British Governor Thomas Hutchinson refused to allow the tea ships to leave without paying the required duty. The situation became a political standoff. Days passed. Crowds gathered. Tensions continued to rise. Then, on the cold evening of December 16, 1773, everything changed. A group of men, many believed to be members of the Sons of Liberty, disguised themselves in clothing inspired by Native Americans. Their appearance wasn't intended to fool anyone. It was a powerful symbol that they no longer wished to be seen as obedient British subjects. Moving quickly through the darkness, they boarded 3 British ships anchored in Boston Harbor. There were no speeches, no warning shots, no negotiations. Working with remarkable discipline, they smashed open more than 340 chests of tea and dumped their contents into the icy water below. By sunrise, nearly 45 tons of tea floated across Boston Harbor. It was one of the boldest acts of political protest in colonial history. To many patriots, it was an act of courage. To Britain, it was the deliberate destruction of private property and a direct challenge to royal authority. Parliament responded with overwhelming force. In 1774, a series of harsh laws were passed against Massachusetts. The British called them the Coercive Acts. Colonists gave them another name, Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed until every penny of the destroyed tea had been repaid. Massachusetts lost much of its self-government. British officials were given greater protection from colonial courts. More troops arrived to enforce royal authority. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, these measures united the colonies. Communities that had once disagreed over British policy now began supporting one another. Food, money, and supplies poured into Boston from neighboring colonies. For the first time, many Americans realized that what happened in one colony could eventually happen to them all. Later that year, representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia. This meeting became known as the First Continental Congress. Its delegates were not yet declaring independence. Most still hoped peace was possible. Many remained loyal to King George III. They simply wanted their traditional rights restored. While politicians debated, both sides quietly prepared for something far more dangerous. War. British General Thomas Gage, commander of British forces in Massachusetts, received orders to disarm the colonial militias. Meanwhile, patriots secretly collected muskets, gunpowder, and supplies throughout the countryside. Every village, every town, every meeting house. Everyone knew that a confrontation was becoming unavoidable. Then, on the night of April 18, 1775, British troops quietly marched out of Boston under the cover of darkness. Their mission was simple: travel to Concord, seize the colonial weapons, arrest patriot leaders if possible. But the patriots were already watching. Messengers raced across the countryside, warning that British soldiers were on the move. Among them was one man whose midnight ride would become an American legend, Paul Revere. Warning spread from town to town as church bells rang and militia companies rushed to prepare. By dawn, armed colonists stood waiting in the small village of Lexington. Neither side fully expected what would happen next. A single gunshot echoed across the morning air. To this day, historians still debate who fired first. But once the shooting began, there was no turning back. The American Revolutionary War had begun. The conflict that followed would reshape not only America but the entire world. The first shots, fired at Lexington and Concord, changed history forever. What had begun as a political dispute was now an open war. The smoke rising from the villages of Massachusetts carried a message across the Atlantic. The British Empire was no longer dealing with protests. It was facing an armed rebellion. As British troops retreated back toward Boston, thousands of colonial militiamen surrounded them, firing from behind stone walls, trees, and farmhouses. Unlike the disciplined formations of the British Army, colonists used the landscape to their advantage, turning the long march into a deadly struggle. By the time the British reached Boston, they had suffered hundreds of casualties. The impossible had happened. Ordinary farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and local militia had stood their ground against one of the world's most powerful armies. Winning a few early battles was one thing. Defeating the British Empire was something entirely different. The colonies desperately needed leadership. In May 1775, representatives gathered once again in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. This time, the situation was far more serious. Fighting had already begun. Delegates knew they needed a united army. They also needed someone capable of leading it. Their choice was George Washington, a respected Virginian who had gained military experience during the French and Indian War. On June 15, 1775, Washington was unanimously appointed Commander-in-Chief of the newly created Continental Army. He accepted the responsibility with humility, understanding that failure could mean the collapse of the entire revolutionary movement. Washington faced enormous challenges from the very beginning. Soldiers were not professional troops. Many had never fought in a major battle. Some arrived carrying hunting rifles instead of military muskets. Others lacked proper uniforms, boots, blankets, or even enough ammunition. The army suffered from shortages of food, medicine, and supplies. Many enlistments lasted only a few months. Every day, men went home as their terms expired. Washington wasn't simply building an army. He was trying to create a nation before that nation even existed. Came another brutal test. On June 17, 1775, British forces launched an assault against colonial positions overlooking Boston during the Battle of Bunker Hill. Although history remembers it by that name, much of the fighting actually took place on nearby Breach Hill. Wave after wave of British soldiers advanced uphill under relentless colonial fire. Defenders held their ground until they nearly ran out of ammunition. Only then were they forced to retreat. Technically, Britain won the battlefield. The victory came at a terrible cost. More than 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded. For British commanders, the battle was deeply unsettling. If poorly equipped colonial fighters could inflict such heavy losses, ending the rebellion would be far more difficult than anyone in London had imagined. The Patriots' Bunker Hill proved something equally important. They could stand toe-to-toe with Britain's finest soldiers. Revolution suddenly seemed possible. Still, the war was far from over. The following year, another extraordinary moment changed the course of history. On July 4, 1776, the Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence, drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson. The document announced that the 13 colonies were no longer subjects of the British Crown. Instead, they declared themselves free and independent states. It was one of the boldest political statements ever written. But signing a declaration did not guarantee freedom. The British Army remained one of the strongest military forces on Earth. King George III had no intention of recognizing American independence. In fact, the most difficult years of the war were only beginning. British forces captured New York City after a series of devastating defeats for Washington's army. The Continental Army suffered heavy losses. Many soldiers deserted. Others questioned whether the revolution could survive. For a brief moment, complete British victory seemed almost inevitable. Washington refused to surrender. In December 1776, he made one of the boldest decisions of the entire war. A freezing winter night, his exhausted army crossed the ice-filled Delaware River and launched a surprise attack against Hessian troops stationed at Trenton. The victory was small compared to later battles. Psychologically, it changed everything. The Continental Army had proven it could still fight. More importantly, it restored hope. Hope would become Washington's greatest weapon. The harshest test still lay ahead. The brutal winter at Valley Forge would determine whether the revolution could survive or disappear forever. While the Americans struggled to stay alive, an unexpected ally was quietly watching from across the Atlantic. That ally would eventually transform a colonial rebellion into a global war. The winter of 1777 was unlike anything the Continental Army had ever experienced. At Valley Forge, just outside Philadelphia, nearly 12,000 American soldiers settled into a frozen encampment that would become one of the greatest symbols of endurance in American history. The enemy wasn't just the British Army anymore. It was hunger, disease, exhaustion, the bitter cold. Many soldiers had no proper shoes, wrapped their feet in pieces of cloth as they marched through snow, stained with blood. Food was scarce. Supplies arrived slowly, if at all. Smallpox, typhus, and other diseases spread through the camp, killing thousands before they ever had the chance to face the British on the battlefield. From the outside, it looked as though the revolution was collapsing. Many European observers believed the American rebellion would soon disappear. Even some patriots began to question whether independence was still possible. Valley Forge became something far more important than a place of suffering. It became the birthplace of a professional army. In February 1778, a former Prussian officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived at the camp. He barely spoke English, yet through interpreters, demonstrations, and relentless discipline, transformed inexperienced volunteers into trained soldiers. Taught them how to march together, how to reload faster, how to fight in formation, how to survive as one united force. By the time spring arrived, the Continental Army was no longer a collection of local militias. It had become a disciplined fighting force capable of challenging Britain's professional army. While Washington was rebuilding his army, another battle had already changed the course of the war. In October 1777, American forces achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Saratoga. British General John Burgoyne had planned to isolate New England from the rest of the colonies. Instead, his army became surrounded and was forced to surrender. More than 5,000 British soldiers laid down their weapons. It was one of the greatest defeats the British Empire had suffered during the entire conflict. Saratoga's greatest impact wasn't felt on the battlefield. It was felt across the Atlantic. For years, France had secretly supplied the American rebels with weapons, ammunition, and money. After Saratoga, the French government reached a historic conclusion. Americans could actually win. In 1778, France officially entered the war as an ally of the United States. What had begun as a colonial rebellion suddenly became an international conflict. It was no longer fighting one enemy. It now faced France, followed later by Spain and the Dutch Republic. British ships, soldiers, and resources had to be deployed across Europe, the Caribbean, North America, Africa, and Asia. The empire was stretched further than ever before. Meanwhile, the fighting continued across the American colonies. The British shifted their strategy toward the south, believing they would find stronger loyalist support there. Major battles erupted across Georgia and the Carolinas. War became increasingly brutal. Communities were divided. Neighbors fought neighbors. Families found themselves on opposite sides of the conflict. Revolution was no longer simply a war against Britain. It had become a civil war among Americans themselves. Then came the campaign that would decide everything. In 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis established his army at Yorktown, Virginia. He expected support from the powerful Royal Navy. Instead, events unfolded in a way few had imagined. The French fleet under Admiral de Grasse defeated the British Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake, cutting Cornwallis off from escape by sea. At the same time, George Washington and French General Comte de Rochambeau marched their combined forces south. Nearly 17,000 American and French troops surrounded Yorktown. British artillery answered with cannon fire. American and French guns fired back day and night. The siege tightened. Supplies disappeared. Hope faded. After weeks of relentless bombardment, Cornwallis realized there was no escape. On October 19, 1781, the British Army formally surrendered. It was one of the most significant moments in modern history. Though smaller battles continued, Yorktown effectively ended Britain's ability to continue the war. 2 years later, in 1783, representatives met in Paris to negotiate peace. The result was the Treaty of Paris. Britain officially recognized the independence of the United States. Borders of the new nation stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. A new republic had been born. But perhaps the greatest lesson of the American Revolution isn't the one most people expect. It wasn't simply a story of heroic colonists defeating a mighty empire. It was a story of impossible choices, divided families, of competing ideas about liberty, loyalty, and government. It was shaped by global politics, economic pressures, foreign alliances, and countless ordinary people whose names rarely appear in history books. The revolution didn't just create the United States. It inspired future revolutions in Europe, Latin America, and beyond. It transformed the balance of power across the world. And it proved that even the strongest empire could be challenged when history, determination, and opportunity came together at exactly the right moment. The legend of American independence is powerful. The full story is even more remarkable. History is rarely as simple as we are taught. Sometimes, the truth is far more fascinating than the myth.